What is going on, everybody, and welcome back to the channel, and welcome back to my Indiana Jones reviews leading up to Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny in just a week away. Last week I talked about my personal favorite Indiana Jones movie, The Last Crusade, and now this week I get to talk about probably the most talked about Indiana Jones movie. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is honestly in the eyes of the beholder. And that's Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull came out in 2008 and is once again directed by Steven Spielberg, and once again stars Harrison Ford as the title character, Indiana Jones. And this is a movie that was talked about a lot before it came out. When The Last Crusade came out, that was supposed to be the end of the series. It was just supposed to end at a trilogy. Steven Spielberg came up with a shot of Indy riding off into the sunset as a way to visually close the book of the Indiana Jones trilogy. But then, of course, naturally, he kept getting asked when doing promotions for his other films, is he going to make another Indiana Jones? George Lucas was eventually asked that question too. Harrison Ford was asked that question. And it ultimately came down to trying to convince Steven Spielberg to direct another one, which he did not want to do. Seriously, you watch the behind the scenes stuff and Steven Spielberg just openly admits that he did not want to do another Indiana Jones, and it took him a long time to finally convince him to step into the director's chair. I mean, the movie was first talked about in the 90s and they didn't go into production until like the mid 2000s, so it did take quite a bit of time for him to agree to direct this one. Now, if you know the Indiana Jones movies, then you know that this movie has the reputation of being the worst movie in the franchise, the most talked about, like I said earlier, film in the franchise, and I tend to agree with that. I don't hate this movie, but I definitely agree with a lot of the criticisms that come with this movie. But with that being said, there are things in this movie that I do enjoy quite a bit. The movie isn't poorly directed or poorly acted, or it isn't devoid of entertaining action sequences. It just honestly comes down to a lot of the decisions that were made with the script and with characters and set pieces and other technical things that I'll talk about a little bit later that just honestly drag the movie down. And honestly, I don't think I'm going to go through this movie from beginning to end like I did with my previous Indiana Jones reviews. I think I'm just going to go through this review just talking about the things that I like and that I dislike, and if there's certain plot points that I want to talk about, then I'll definitely mention it here and pinpoint where it takes place in the movie. But for this movie and this review, I honestly don't feel like going through the whole entire movie from beginning to end. So like I said, there are things in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull that I do enjoy, and one of the things that I do enjoy in this movie is the beginning of the movie. I do like the sequence of the Russians getting to Area 51, and I do like the opening credits of the movie where we see high school kids racing one of the Russian drivers towards Area 51. It is a pretty entertaining sequence, and I think it does a good job setting the time period that this movie takes place in. It takes place in the late 1950s. And like I said before, I do like this opening with the Russians in Area 51, and I like the fact that this movie addressed that this area where the Ark of the Covenant was taken at the end of the first film is Area 51. And despite the fact that some people have pointed out that this opening kind of gets a lot out of the way really quickly. For instance, we get to meet the main villain of the movie, the big muscle man that Indy eventually is going to fight in the movie, the side character, and then we already have a twist with the side character, Mac. He's first on Indy's side, and then he turns his gun on Indy, so then he goes with the Russians. There's a lot that this movie does in the beginning, and a lot of people have pointed out that it doesn't feel right that it does so much this early. And even though I kind of agree with that, like I said, I do enjoy this opening enough. But since I brought up that side character, let me quick mention Mac to get him out of the way quickly. I really don't like this character. He's been described from Steven Spielberg as the most complex, complicated character they've created, and that's just fancy term of saying they had no idea what to do with this character. At least that's how it comes off, because at first when we meet him, he's with Indy, and then just out of nowhere, he turns sides and sides with the Russians. And then later in the movie, during the jungle chase, he decides to go back on Indy's side because Indy has the upper hand. But then when he sees that the Russians are quickly gaining track with Indy to Akator, where they need to take the Crystal Skull, then he changes sides with the Russians, only for him to go back to Indy's side when the Russians get sucked up in the giant UFO at the end. I'm sorry, it really feels like they had no idea what to do with this character. Honestly, this character should have been a character that is introduced in the beginning and then died somewhere in the middle of the movie. Honestly, you take him out of the movie and it probably would have been a lot better, which sucks because I think Ray Winstone is a really great actor and this character had potential. It's just he was poorly written, and like I said, it feels like they just didn't know what to do with him. Easily one of the most talked about scenes in this movie is when Indy is in the fridge when the nuclear bomb goes off. But I'll say this about that scene, I do really like how it's set up. After Indy escapes the Russians from the beginning of the movie, he gets to the city, this town, and then he gets into one of the houses and he sees that there's mannequins in the house and there's mannequins outside of the house. And then he hears the alarm going off and then the camera pans in on the bomb that's about to go off, and it's a really great setup. It's just that it ends really stupidly. We all know about Indy getting in the fridge when the bomb goes off because it's a lead-lined fridge, and the fridge just goes flying after the explosion, tumbles, I don't know how many times, like 20 times almost, and he just rolls out of it like nothing happened, even though he should be Indiana Jones soup in there. In fact, I wanted to bring up this scene because I want to talk about my friend's reaction to when this scene happened. So my friend, one of my best friends who's seen this movie for the first time recently, has never seen any of the Indiana Jones movies. He knows about this scene and he knows the reputation that this scene has. But it was funny when this scene happened because when he grabbed everything out of the fridge and he got in the fridge, he saw the sign that said lead lined and he goes, oh, but it's a lead lined fridge. So I don't get what people hate about this scene. And then the explosion happens and then he sees the fridge go flying. And as it tumbles, he goes, oh. And I was like, yeah. And then he rolls out and then he goes, okay, yeah, I understand now. And I'm like, yeah, it's probably the dumbest moment in any of these movies. Now, I will mention this also. I do agree it was pretty stupid in Temple of Doom when Indy, Willie, and Short Round jumped out of the plane with just the life raft, and they somehow landed in the snow with no broken bones, nothing, not a scratch on them. I will admit that was stupid too. But for me, out of the two scenarios, jumping out of a plane with a raft or surviving an explosion in a pretty cramped fridge, the life raft seems a tad bit more believable that they would survive that, even though they should have had like 30 broken bones when they landed. So yes, that scene was stupid in Temple of Doom, but this scene with the fridge takes the cake for stupidest things that have happened in these movies. And I do like the fact that this movie addressed 1950s government paranoia that was a real thing that happened in the 1950s. After that big explosion scene with the fridge, Indy is questioned by US government officials, and then he ends up getting fired from his job at the college, and that stuff is all pretty interesting. The downside to that scene is that it's, number one, never brought up again, and the situation with Indy being questioned by the US government is never resolved. Yeah, he gets his job back at the end of the movie, but there was never a scene either in the middle of the movie or at the end of the movie with the government official saying, you know what, you've done all this, Indy, you were right, you're not a communist after all, you're on our side. You know, yeah, that sounds pretty stupid to do that, but obviously professional writers in Hollywood would have made a scene like that work. That's honestly, for me, one of the parts in this movie that could have worked really effectively. It's just that, like I said, it's never brought up again. It's a good setup, just abandoned as soon as it's brought up. Another scene that I like in this movie is the 1950s diner scene. Here, Indy meets Mutt Williams, and we as an audience get to know a little bit more about Mutt Williams in this scene. And really quickly, with Mutt Williams, he's okay. I don't hate his character like everyone else does. Everyone hates his character. I don't hate him. Shia LaBeouf is definitely giving a great performance. He's giving a great performance with what he's given. But with what he's given doesn't fully match an Indiana Jones adventure, if that makes sense. Sure, he's a greaser and that fits with the time period. But for this adventure, it just doesn't it just doesn't work. At least for me, it doesn't work. So to me, there's good aspects of Mutt Williams, but there's also aspects that just don't fully work. So I can't really say I hate his character because I do understand what they were trying to do with the character. It just didn't fully work. But like I said, this diner sequence is where we get introduced to the Crystal Skull in the movie, and Indy is giving, an exposition dialogue on what the Crystal Skull's about, what Akator is about. We also get knowledge of another character named Oxley that Mutt knows and Indy used to know. And it's a big exposition scene, and even though there's not really anything visually entertaining that's happening, it is a pretty entertaining scene. Seeing Harrison Ford and Shia LaBeouf go back and forth off of each other, it's done well enough to keep your interest. And then it ends with a bar fight, which then leads to a chase sequence, which is a very entertaining scene. This whole diner scene, going to the chase after the chase, is very entertaining, and it's one of the highlights of the movie. And after Indy and Mutt find out that they have to go to Peru to find the skull, and then they eventually do find the skull, the Russians, of course, meet up with them and they capture them, and then Indy and the gang, they get free of the Russians. And also, I do like in this scene where they're captured, we do get to meet Marion Ravenwood in the movie again, and I do like the fact that she's in this movie. I like Karen Allen, I like Marion Ravenwood. It's great to see her in the movie, and she does have a lot of great stuff, a lot of great dialogue with Indiana Jones. The problem with her character, though, is that she doesn't have anything to do besides drive the car during the jungle chase, which everyone likes to make fun of, apparently. And it is pretty disappointing because, like I said, other than driving the car during the jungle chase, she doesn't really have anything to do. You can honestly take her out of the movie, and it wouldn't have been affected all that way. The main purpose of her character in the film is for her to say that Mutt Williams is Indiana Jones' son. But Karen Allen is just so entertaining as Marion Ravenwood. It is a little disappointing that they didn't give her much to do, but it is a great highlight seeing her in this movie, and she does give a really great performance. But once Indy and the gang escape the Russians in the jungle, I do like the quicksand bits, or the dry sand as Indy calls it. I do like that scene, even though, like I said, the only purpose of that scene is to learn that Mutt Williams is Indiana Jones' son. But I do really love, actually, that Mutt Williams says when Indy and Marion are getting lowered, he says, "I'm going to go find something to get you guys out," and the only thing he brings back is a rat snake. And Indiana Jones is afraid of snakes, so when it's his turn to get out of it, he's all freaking out and trying to shoo it away. And I love the fact that he will not grab the snake unless you call it a rope. It's unbelievable that a snake would pull someone out of quicksand, especially when Indy said when they just started to go down, it's like trying to lift a car. So it's a little unbelievable, at least to my knowledge, it's unbelievable. But like I said, it's an entertaining sequence enough, so I'm willing to just roll with it. The jungle chase after has pros and cons. Pros because it is a well-directed sequence, but cons because there's other things that just don't work in this sequence. The CGI doesn't really work in this sequence. In fact, the CGI in this throughout this entire movie doesn't really hold up at all these years later. In fact, the only CGI sequences that do hold up in this movie is the big nuclear explosion after Indy gets out of the fridge and the fire ants. Besides that, everything else is very hit and miss. But the fire ants sequence after that is another moment that I do like in the movie, and I do like Indy's fight with the big Russian guy. It is pretty brutal and white knuckle, but it doesn't feel like there's any tension really. It feels like Indy's on top of the fight, even though there's only one moment where he seems like he's lost his energy and he doesn't know how he's going to fight this guy. It's like a second long, but besides that, it honestly feels like Indy is on top of things in this fight. Entertaining sequence, but not enough tension. And honestly, the last thing that I do really like in this movie is Harrison Ford himself. A lot of people were worried when this movie came out, is he too old to be Indiana Jones again? Should they cast a younger actor? But he proved that he can still do the role very well. He's very good in the movie. He gives a great performance. There's just, and I hate to say this, I hate to say stuff that I do like in the movie. There's negatives that kind of go with it, but that's the unfortunate part of this movie. Even though Harrison Ford is really good in the movie, his performance is top notch. It's great. The downside of his character, though, is that he he doesn't feel like a human at times, if that makes sense. An aspect of Indiana Jones that people bring up all the time, and honestly I do too because it's a great thing about the character, is that he's not a superhero. He's just a human. He gets his ass handed to him a lot in the original trilogy. He has to fight his way back in every low point that he has. Honestly, at the lowest points that you would get if you were Indiana Jones, most people would just say, screw it, I'm done. It's over. I don't think I'm going to get up from this. But Indy fights his way back, and that's why we love the character so much. He refuses to stay down. But here in this movie, there's really aren't any moments like that. Like I said, there's like 1 second of it with the fight with the Russian. But besides that, it's like Indiana Jones is almost untouchable when it comes to tension or humanizing him in a way, so to speak. And that's probably because from the time period between The Last Crusade and Crystal Skull, Indy, the character, became such an iconic classic. It's almost like the writer David Koepp or Steven Spielberg or George Lucas were just like, no, we can't do anything that could like ruin his character. But in a way, with not doing anything like that, you ended up ruining him just a little bit. It's complicated to explain, but Indy went from this big action hero that we love to see fight his way out of his situations. And there are times where he does have to fight his way out of the situations. It's just that there's no grit, no teeth to it, no tension with it. And that's the unfortunate part of Indy's character, despite the fact that Harrison Ford gives a great performance here. Honestly, everything else in the movie, I kind of is just like, it's whatever, or I just do not like. There are quite a bit of bad decisions in this movie, and I've heard people talk about for years, how did these decisions get made with Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, the same team that made the original trilogy? How did these decisions get made? And I really hate to say this because I don't like trashing filmmakers all that much, but there's quite a bit of behind the scenes sequences in the DVD and Blu-ray of this where Steven Spielberg says, this decision George Lucas wanted to do and I didn't want to do it, but we went with it anyway. The whole alien thing, a lot of people don't really like that aspect of the movie, myself included. It doesn't feel like Indiana Jones. It feels like a sci-fi movie trying to be Indiana Jones. That was a George Lucas idea that Steven Spielberg did not want to do, but they went along with it because George Lucas kept insisting. It's just that with George Lucas, it feels like from like the mid to late 90s all the way to the late 2000s, he just had a long string of bad ideas for his movies. I know a lot of people like the Star Wars prequels more so than they have before nowadays, and I'm not going to make this a Star Wars prequel bashing part or whatever, but there are a lot of bad decisions in those movies. I don't like a lot of the decisions he made with the special editions of the original trilogy, which happened in the late 90s. And a lot of the bad decisions in Crystal Skull, they honestly feel like ideas that George Lucas would have came up with. And that's unfortunate because, George Lucas, I have a lot of respect for the guy. He created two of my favorite movie franchises of all time, Star Wars and Indiana Jones. But he also came up with a lot of bad decisions for those franchises as well that unfortunately drag the films down quite a bit. It's just that if you watch a lot of the behind the scenes stuff, there's quite a bit of moments in there where Steven Spielberg says, I didn't want to do this, but George Lucas insisted, so we did it anyway. And it's like, well, you kind of have to come up with a compromise. You can't just let one person make decisions that you don't like and then just roll with it. Even if Steven Spielberg really didn't want to do this movie, you still committed to the job. You have to come up with a compromise if there's a bad idea. There have been behind the scenes stuff in the previous movies where Steven Spielberg admitted that he didn't like certain things that George Lucas came up with, so they changed it. Why did that not happen here? I don't know what happened with that. But like everyone else, I don't really like the fact that this movie went with an aliens plot. I know they were trying to make it, the behind the scenes features said that they were trying to make this like those 1950s B movies that came out. But at the end of the day, it doesn't feel like those 1950s B movies. Sure, you could say they're homaging it, but you can really feel like they were trying to make this movie like that. And it just doesn't come off as that. It just feels like another movie inspired by those action adventure serials from the late 30s that the original trilogy was based off of. And when you're taking 1950s sci-fi stuff with 1930s action-adventure serials, the puzzle pieces, they're not going to fit together. Either go with a 50s sci-fi genre or go with the action-adventure serials from the 30s. Don't try to combine two things that just don't work together. And I also don't like how this movie looks on DVD or Blu-ray. The cinematographer, I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name. Apparently he's a great cinematographer in other films. Oh, an award-winning cinematographer from what I heard. But I don't know what happened with this film. It just looks too bright, too saturated, and too artificial. Honestly, if you're going to watch this movie on physical content, don't watch the DVD or Blu-ray. I'm going to say, if you want to watch this movie physically, buy the new 4K that came out, because they recolored this movie with HDR coloring, and it looks so much better. It looks just like the original trilogy. The colors feel more natural. It's not bright and oversaturated, and it kind of takes away from the fakeness that a lot of the scenes had before. But because of how it looked before, a simple scene like in the beginning of the movie when Indy's talking to the Russians before they get into Area 51, it looks fake. It looks artificial. And that had a lot to do with how the cinematographer shot and colored the movie. Also, after the jungle chase, the movie just completely falls apart to the very end of the film. Our characters are in this military car that goes off a cliff into water, and then they fall 3 times down waterfalls. Number one, that's just... this is what? But then when they get into the place that they need to take this crystal skull from, it's just set piece after set piece after set piece with no tension. Remember the beginning of Raiders of the Lost Ark? Yeah, that was one big set piece. And yeah, the golden idol that Indy was after didn't have anything to do with the Ark of the Covenant. But because of how that scene was shot and set up, and the music and the booby traps, it felt tension-filled. Even though it's the beginning of the movie, we know Indy's gonna make it out of there, but it still felt like it had tension in it. Here, when they're going through that giant arm thing that they're standing in, and then they fall through, and then they're running down the steps as the steps are closing in, and then they get to the City of Gold, and then they're being chased by the whatever it is, people, those local people that are there, and then they finally get to the City of Gold, and then they get to the main area where all the other crystal skulls are at. It just comes off a little boring at times when there's no stakes or tension. Yeah, they're trying to build up that the Russians are after them, and Mac, of course, changes his loyalty and he's leading the Russians to them. But honestly, both of them, the Russians and Indy and the gang, they're both going to make it to Akator. So honestly, that tension that could have been set up there isn't even there at all. So yeah, unfortunately, the ending of the movie, that could have been really cool, just kind of falls apart as it goes along. And with the big CGI flying saucer that comes out at the end of the movie, it doesn't work for me as well. It honestly feels like taking the crystal skull to Akator didn't really lead to anything, because the aliens then just disappear into thin air to another dimension. And it's like, what did we earn from this ending? All the other films, at the very end of the movie, it led to something. The first film, Raiders, ended with Indy being screwed out of not knowing where the Ark is going to go. So like I said, that kind of ended on a bit of a depressing note, but that led to some conflict at least. The ending of Temple of Doom led to Indy freeing all of these kids, so this village in India now has life back. And the ending of Last Crusade ended with Indy and his father having reconnected with each other. There's nothing like that here in Crystal Skull. The chemistry between Indy and Mutt Williams is nowhere near as strong as Indy with his father. And at the very, very end of the movie, it ends with Indiana and Marion getting married, which I should have mentioned that in my positives. I do like that scene quite a bit. Since Mutt Williams is Indy's son, it honestly makes sense that Indy would marry Marion. And like I said, those two characters work great off each other, and it was great to see Marion in this movie, so I'm glad there was a positive part to the ending of this movie. But like everyone else, I got worried when Indy's hat came to Mutt and he went to put it on. I was like, I don't know about that. But then Indy takes the hat away from him and puts it on, and then the Raiders March starts, and I was like, okay, whew. They understand that that hat is Indy's. Don't give it to Mutt Williams. Don't give it to anyone else. So guys, in the end, even though there are quite a bit of scenes in this movie that I do not like at all, or just don't fully work for me, or just fine, whatever, there are a lot of parts in this movie that I do really enjoy. It's just that the negatives in this movie really overshadow the positives, and those positives end up being just little moments here and there that I do enjoy watching from time to time. Don't really necessarily, now that I've seen the movie a bunch of times, I don't really necessarily need to see the whole movie just to watch those sequences. And that is not a good sign. That's very unfortunate for an Indiana Jones movie. I can't imagine skipping any part of the original 3 movies. But here, if I'm not like fully watching the movie, if I'm just like watching Crystal Skull while I'm doing something, I can honestly skip quite a bit of scenes in this movie and it wouldn't affect my watching experience at all. And like I said, that's not a very good sign. And that's also unfortunate because I remember seeing this movie back in theaters in 2008 and I liked it a lot when I first saw it. It's just that, very similar to the Star Wars prequels, when I was younger, I really liked them. But then as I got older, I've been able to see more of the problems that the film causes, and it has affected my viewing experiences as I got into an adult. However, if I have the choice to pick Crystal Skull or the Star Wars prequels, I would rather pick Crystal Skull, honestly. So yeah, I don't hate Crystal Skull. There's a lot that I enjoy, but I can't ignore a lot of the bad decisions that were made in this film. So overall, I would say, see, a part of me wants to say it's a major letdown, and technically it is a major letdown, but like I said, this isn't a terrible movie. It's not completely unwatchable, so I would say either check this out on the Redbox or check it out on Disney+. It is worth watching. It just do not expect anywhere near what the original 3 were if you haven't seen this movie. Honestly, it's unfortunate because a 4th Indiana Jones movie could have been great like the original movies, but bad decisions were made on top of entertaining decisions that were made in this film. It's a mixed bag, so if you haven't seen the movie, lower your expectations quite a bit. So guys, that is my review for Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and I am so glad that I have been able to talk about these movies before Dial of Destiny comes out. I did plan on doing Indiana Jones reviews before in the past, but I'm glad I've waited until Dial of Destiny comes out. And speaking of Dial of Destiny, we are just a week away from that movie coming out, and I am just so excited. It's my most anticipated movie of the year. So guys, just like always, let me know your thoughts and opinions on Crystal Skull down in the comment section below. And just like always, guys, thank you again so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. If you enjoyed this video, then don't forget to like and share it. Subscribe right here if you haven't already. And until next time, guys, take care.